Welcome everybody to the Zoom presentation on women in sports by Dr. Elizabeth Benyi. This presentation is co-sponsored by the Carnegie Museum of the Keweenaw and riseUP, recognizing the importance of women's suffrage everywhere, Upper Peninsula. I'm Faith Morrison from riseUP, and I'll be serving as your moderator. First, some technical details. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, the presentation is taking place by Zoom. And we're grateful to Elizabeth for her willingness to move to this platform and to share her research with us. Due to national reports of misuse of the Zoom platform, we've got everybody muted, and so they're a little bit restricted, unfortunately. But we'll towards the end of the talk, we'll unmute people and allow you to ask questions. The chat window is open, so please use that to add a question for the speaker or to share your women in sports story. At the end of the talk, I'll unmute questioners one at a time to answer questions. If you have any technical questions, please also send those to the chat. So this event is one in a series of local events that serves to commemorate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the United States, commemorate the suffrage and acquisition of full citizenship rights by all populations, highlights the civic and cultural contributions of women, and encourage everyone to exercise their right to vote. The 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution came into force on 26 August 1920, 100 years ago this summer. It reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." The talk we'll hear tonight highlights women in sports, their interests, their participation. In particularly, we will highlight the women of the Copper Country here in Michigan. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Elizabeth Benyi. Elizabeth is a retired physician and active sportswoman who has lived in the Copper Country for over 20 years. She's played competitive sports since elementary school, earning presidential fitness patches every year and competing in varsity sports in high school and at Michigan State University. After college, she was a semi-pro racquetball player, traveling all over the country for tournaments. She also played competitive volleyball and softball every year until well into her 40s. She remains active today with road cycling, kayaking, snowshoeing, cross-country skiing. She picked the right place to live. Elizabeth's presentation today is titled Women in Sports, and Elizabeth, we welcome you and look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Faith, and thank you everybody for attending this presentation. This is not exactly the platform that I was hoping to be able to do this with. We had a very nice program planned where we were going to do skills stations and invite high school teams and really have a interactive participatory type of presentation. But I'll do my best, and hopefully you'll find some interesting information and find this to be enjoyable. I titled this A Brief Look at Women's Sports. And the reason why I did that is because this easily could be a discussion that could go on for several hours, talking about all of the accomplishments that women have performed in sports. But we're going to focus on how things shaped women's sports in modern society, and more importantly, how women's sports became a gateway for participation of women in other sectors of society, particularly in opportunities for employment and recognition. So moving on, this is a picture of my varsity sweater from high school. And if you notice the letters GAA on the F for Fortson, I went to Fortson High School in Dearborn. We're going to talk a lot about GAA and how it helped shape sports in junior high and high schools and helped elevate women's competitive sports. The different badges that are on the letter are the different sports that I participated in: softball, volleyball, basketball, field hockey, swimming, and diving. And then, of course, I was the class of '73. The next series of slides here is a timeline of the history of female athletes in California. The reason why I picked this timeline is because it's probably one of the most complete timelines you will find on female athletics, and it greatly reflects the timeline in US history as well. In 1896, women were banned from the first modern Olympics. However, 4 years later in 1900, women were allowed to participate in the Olympics. In 1907, girls basketball was declared as being harmful because it was too rough and tumble, too competitive, women could get heart lesions, and women belonged in the kitchen and not on the playing fields. This was part of a very acrimonious debate about women being able to participate in athletics and sports. However, in 1910, intramural competition, meaning within the schools themselves, between classes, they were allowed to have competitions in things such as jump rope, hiking, and wall climbing. Not really what I would call high-level sports, but it's a start. In 1920, the GAA was formed. This was the Girls Athletic Association, and their areas of focus were basketball, softball, volleyball, dance, tennis, bowling, and archery. Also in 1920, the NAGWS, or the National Association of Girls and Women's Sports, were formed. In 1928, the CIFSS, this was the California Interschool Sports, passed a motion that girls could now compete interscholastically, meaning between schools, but they must be coached by women. One of the things I wanted to point out about the CIFSS is it was only a board of men. There were no women allowed on this particular board. Going on in the history of with the California timeline, in 1928, women ran track in the modern Olympics for the first time. However, at the conclusion of the 800 relay, they were so fatigued that the 800 relay was banned for women until 1960. In 1932, Lillian Copeland was the first American woman to win gold in the Olympics in the discus throw. In 1952, Mo Conley, now mind you, these are all athletes that came out of California. Mo Conley won Wimbledon. She was the first American to win in the Grand Slam series from California. In 1960, this is a watershed moment for two reasons. First of all, this is when Billie Jean King starts her professional tennis career. But what made her so vital to women's sports is that she went on to champion women's sports, forming a sports foundation, and also fought for parity in tennis, gaining equal pay for female champions in tennis at the US Open, to be paid as much as the men champions. And of course, she's been inducted into the Tennis Hall of Fame. I don't know if anybody was alive or remembered the Battle of the Sexes when she beat Bobby Riggs in that tennis match. I remember having a big bet with my dad, and I was never so proud as the moment when she won that match. But the other big watershed moment in 1960 was has a very huge impact on women's sports. And this was the 1960 Olympics. The USSR, which was the Russian Federation at the time, kicked butt so much in women's sports, they completely dominated, that the United States finally made a commitment to trying to help develop women's sports in junior high and high school, to help develop athletes. Moving on in the timeline here, 1970, girls basketball moves from half court, 6 women, where you were only allowed to play half court, and each team had 6 women. They then moved from that to full court basketball, 5-person basketball, following the same rules as men's basketball. In 1971, GIAB, the Girls Interscholastic Advisory Board, took over control of young women's sports, interscholastic sports from CISS. Remember, that was the foundation or the group that was boarded by only men. In 1972, another watershed moment in women's sports, and this is when Title IX was signed into law. 1973, Mary Decker was a middle distance runner. Now remember, back in 1928, they had run the 800 relay and were fatigued. This is one woman running a leg of 200 meters. Mary Decker in 1973 was a middle distance Olympian. She won gold in the 1500 and the 3000 meter, and she set world records in the mile, the 5,000, and the 10,000. She was also the first woman to break the 4-minute 20-second mile. In 1989, moving on through the timeline, Janet Evans, she won multiple gold medals in swimming in the Olympics. 1990, this should be a familiar name to anybody that pays attention to women's basketball. Lisa Leslie became an Olympic basketball champion. 1992, Lindsay Davenport becomes the Wimbledon champion. In 1999, Amanda Beard becomes another multiple gold medal swimming champion. Here is another familiar name that people should know if you follow the Olympics and track and field at all. Allison Felix in 2003 became multiple track champion. And here's another interesting fact. In 2014, girls wrestling was added to the interscholastic sports. So you can see this is a pretty comprehensive timeline and greatly mirrors what was going on nationally as well. So I was grateful to be able to find this timeline. This next slide talks about the Girls Athletic Association. This is out of the University of Buffalo. There was an essay about the Girls Athletic Association that first appeared in the 1923 issue of the Irish Yearbook at the University of Buffalo. And Viola Hilton was the first president, Alice W. Carey considered first vice president, Marion Shanley, the second vice president, and Rebecca Dane, secretary. The sports of interest in GAA, again, were basketball, swimming, hiking, bowling, horseback, baseball, and tennis. This is an article from Carmel, California by Andrew Wright. I don't know what the date of this article was, but it talked about the history of GAA in Carmel. The reason why I brought this up, because it talked a lot about the difficulties of women in sport. And although GAA centered pretty much on basketball, there were a variety of other seasonal sports and intramural and interscholastic sports that were championed by the GAA. But one of the things that I wanted to point out is that in the earliest years of GAA, the girls had to actually fund the program on their own, and they were not allowed to hire coaches. So they relied very heavily on volunteer faculty to give up their personal time after school for coaching the girls' sports. In 1903, Noblesville had formed a GAA, but the girls were not allowed to use the gymnasium at the school. So the girls modified the basement into a gym and into a basketball court. And moving on, there's also including the history of Title IX in Carmel. Title IX was introduced in Congress and passed and signed into law by Nixon in 1972. And in 1972, the Supreme Court ruled that girls were allowed to play on boys' teams if there was no provision made for the girls' teams. There were lots of obstacles that were placed in, obviously, in the way of girls participating. Another reason why I wanted to include the slide is to show the two pictures. The top picture is the half-court 6-person on each team. And then the bottom picture is when they went to full court basketball with 5 people on each team. The other thing I wanted to point out is the uniforms on the bottom. I think this was standard issue for high schools that participated in GAA, because that sure looks like my uniform. Blue shorts with a white button-down shirt. Can you imagine trying to keep a white button-down shirt clean in gym and in sports? And this final page, I wanted to just show the bathing suit too, because again, I think that was standard issue for girls that participated in GAA sports, because that's what my swimsuit looked like in junior high and high school. This next series of slides is focusing on a study. This was a study that was done by the Women's Sports Foundation with the help of Dick's Sporting Goods Foundation that provided a grant. It was published in July of 2019. It's over 300 pages long, and it's just chock full of data. We're just going to cover some of the highlights of this, and it is readily available for full review if you're a real data hound. But basically, this report is broken down into 2 sections. The first section deals with the landscape of high school sports and details how different populations fare and how many teams are fielded in the overall trends in high school sports. Section 2 of the report talks about the influence of high school sports on adolescent development and the links between sport on psychological health, drug abuse, academic achievement, and academic finance. This is the executive summary. It's only several pages, and it draws out some of the key features of the findings. The first key finding is that there's a rising trend in U.S. public schools for dropping all sports programs. In the year 1999 to 2000, there was an 11.3% drop in high school athletics. In the year 2009-2010, there was a 22% drop. And in 2015-2016, a 23.5% drop. So this is a very troubling trend in the high school system. Key finding number 2, the public schools with high poverty levels continue to struggle in offering sports, often offering a third less than the other income levels in sports. Number 3, participation remains steady despite the fact that there is a decrease in programs that are available. Both on the girls' part and the boys' part, participation in sports still remains very steady. Finding number 5, girls' participation still lags, however, behind boys, with only 43.6% of girls versus 52.3% of boys. However, sports are even more popular than ever. Even despite the fact that programs are being dropped from the high schools, sports are still extremely popular. And number 7, key finding, high school athletes are highly engaged in school extracurriculars, which is not surprising. Finding number 8, high school athletics yields academic dividends. Number 9, high school athletics are a psychological asset. Number 10, and I thought this was kind of interesting, but I didn't dive deep into it. I'm going to go back and try to read a little bit more on this particular topic, but the questions and answers on substance abuse and athletics, it's a very complex issue. Some substances are heavily abused in athletes, particularly alcohol, marijuana, and of course, anabolic steroids. But there is diminished use of the more hardcore type drugs. But it's still a very complex issue. And this does not have anything to do with income level, race, gender. It's just an extremely complex topic with no real answers. So this slide shows a graphic of the declining trends in schools providing for sports. And you can see that there has been a steady decline. There's always a lag of women's sports being offered behind boys' sports, but the overall trend is still a downward trend. Some other interesting facts that came out of the study: 1 in 3 girls from the age of 6 to 11 participate regularly in sports activity. However, after the age of 13, there's a steep drop off. And there's a number of reasons for this. It seems that the number one reason for girls not participating after the age of 13 is 73% of the girls feel that their parents cannot afford the participation fees. 32% is because of gender beliefs, such as the boys will make fun of me, or it's not ladylike, or, this is not what girls should be doing. There are other imbalances also that limit participation. The fear of injury, and this is not an unfounded fear. We'll show this statistic in a moment, but college female soccer players are 4 times more likely to suffer ACL tears than male soccer players. Another thing that might limit participation in sports: 77% of girls report a lack of female coaches. Another factor is that on a national basis, only 3.2% of all sports coverage is dedicated to women's sports. This is except for Michigan and the Upper Peninsula, and we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail further in the talk. This talks a little bit about some of the gender disparities and the things that affect women. This graphic was called Chasing Equity, trying to get girls to be able to participate more than or as much as boys. This talks about the disparities, particularly with coaching. If you notice in the bottom corner there, in 1971, 90% of NCAA female sports teams were coached by women. By 2019, only 43%. There's also a 5.6 times pay gap between male coaches in NCAA programs and female coaches. 63% of female coaches also reported sex discrimination in the workplace, and 31% of female coaches felt that if they reported Title IX violations, that they would be fired. These next series of slides now, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Title IX and the effect on women's sports. On June 23rd in 1972, Title IX of the Education Amendment was passed by Congress and signed into law by Richard Nixon. However, there were lots of obstacles placed in the way to try to implement Title IX, numerous lawsuits. For instance, in June of 1975, Senator Jesse Helms and Representative Martin publicly condemned Title IX in its entirety on the Senate and House floors. In February of 1976, the NCAA pressed a legal challenge against Title IX. In July of 1978, this was the deadline for all high schools and colleges to comply with Title IX, and this began the decline of high school sports being offered. You can watch the trend from this point on and see the decline because they just did not want to have to comply with Title IX. In 1980, the Department of Education was given oversight of Title IX through the Office of Civil Rights. This has implication today because Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, is the current card holder to all things Title IX. In 1984, the Supreme Court handed down a decision of Grove City versus Bell. It concluded that Title IX only applies to programs receiving federal funds. And from this point forward also is a very steep rise in private high schools and private universities and colleges that did not have to comply with Title IX. Other issues affecting Title IX, in June 23rd, 1997 was the 25th anniversary of the passage of Title IX. In 2001, February, Supreme Court issued a decision of Brentwood versus Tennessee Secondary Schools Athletic Association that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution applied to athletics association in gender equity suits. On December 17th in 2001, Supreme Court also issued a decision, Communities for Equity versus the Michigan High School Athletic Association found that the state of Michigan was liable under Title IX for discriminating against women's sports by forcing them to compete in non-traditional or disadvantageous seasons. So that's just a brief timeline and history and review of Title IX. My personal experience, I played junior varsity volleyball at Michigan State and was on the varsity rowing team and had absolutely no opportunity for athletic scholarship. However, my niece, which I'm very proud of, was the first person in our family to qualify. She got a full ride scholarship to the University of Maryland in track and field. So we still have a ways to go. There's still a gigantic lag of women getting scholarship and having access to college teams. But when I compare my niece, which is only a generation behind me, to my experience, I'm proud of the fact that she was able to gain scholarship through Title IX. Of course, today Title IX has completely shifted its focus. It's gone away from sports and is now focusing purely on sexual assault and forming regulations and how sexual assault is handled on campuses. So it's become a completely different animal now. Moving on now, we're going to talk about sports, women's sports in Michigan. Again, we played six-person half court, which began around 1905, 1906, and then continued until 1969. In 1970, we played the full court five-person basketball. GAA and other athletic associations rapidly added to the sports in the 1960s and 70s. And remember, 1960 was a watershed moment when the USSR completely dominated women's sports. In 1874, as more women gained access to higher education, Dr. Edward Clark published a booklet, Sex in Education, A Fair Chance for Girls. This sparked a tremendous amount of acrimonious debate about the capacity of women for physical activity. This was in that timeline that I showed you from California as well. Between the 1990s and 1930s, competitions for women in intramural club and sorority sports, meaning within the classes or within the school themselves, increased, and there were scheduled play days where women were allowed to compete against other schools. By 1936, 70% of Michigan colleges used these forms for athletics for women. There is limited archival information on Michigan female athletes. MLive did an article of the most famous athletes in all 83 counties in Michigan. This was Scott Pam, and only one woman in that entire article is mentioned. In the vault of 1999, of the 50 greatest sports figures in Michigan, only 4 women are featured. This isn't, some of these women, though, are very interesting and have an astounding career. Marion Ladwick from Grand Rapids was voted the greatest bowler of all time, men or women, in 1973. She had won the U.S. Open for bowling 8 times during the time of 1949 to 1963. Sheila Young-Auschwitz, of course, won 3 of the speed skating medals in the 1970 Olympics. Dawn Riley of Harrison Township was the only female crew member on the boat that won the 1992 America's Cup in sailing. And she went on to captain an all-female crew team in the America's Cup in 1995. And then Kathy Anderson, she was a softball pitcher with the Rayburn Brakettes. She had a pitching record of 38 wins and 26 losses with an ERA of 0.15, considered to be one of the best pitchers ever in the sport. And an interesting data that I found was that 10% of all sports coverage in Michigan or reporting is dedicated to female athletics. But I want to remind you, this is 3 times the national average. So it's not perfect, but it is better. These are some other notable women. These are not necessarily women from Michigan, but I brought these names up because they are not famous people, but they've had outstanding accomplishments and I think should be mentioned. Manon Ream, in 1993, she was the first woman to ever play in one of the major national men's sports. She was a goalie that played in an exhibition game of the Tampa Bay Lightning against the St. Louis Blues. She made 7 saves on 9 shots before she was pulled from the game. Janet Guthrie was in motor racing and had quite an accomplishment, even well before Danica Patrick. In 1977, Guthrie qualified for both the Indianapolis 500 and the Daytona 500. And her 9th place finish in the Indy 500 was the best women's finish and held that until 2005. Ann Myers Drysdale was the first woman to sign an NBA contract as a free agent with the Indiana Pacemakers. Soon after she was cut from the team, though, she went on to become the first female commentator for NBA games. This is a very interesting person. Jackie Mitchell, at the age of 17, signed a contract as a pitcher with the AA Chattanooga Lookouts in 1931. And in her first game, this was an exhibition game against the New York Yankees, she struck out Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig back-to-back. Shannon Easton became the first female to officiate a game because in 2012, the NFL had locked out all the officials, and she was allowed to be a line judge for the St. Louis Rams versus Detroit Lions game. Julie Crone in horse racing, she was the first woman to win a Triple Crown
Elizabeth, your sound is breaking up.
I'm sorry, it could be, can you hear me now?
Yep, now that's good.
Okay. This is one of my favorite stories. Gertrude Ederle, in 1926, at the age of 19, she was the first woman to swim across the English Channel, taking 14 and a half hours to swim the 35 miles. She topped the men's record by over 2 hours. Prior to that, 2 years prior to that, she had won 2 gold medals in the 1924 Paris Olympics at age 17. Althea Gibson, she is commonly referred to as the female Jackie Robinson. She was a multi-sport professional, a professional tennis player, as well as a professional golfer. She was the first Black athlete to cross the color line of international tennis. In 1956, she became the first African-American to win a Grand Slam title, winning the French Championship. And then the following year, she won also Wimbledon and the U.S. Nationals, which was the precursor to the U.S. Open. So she had a 1 year winning the 3 major titles, although it wasn't in the same year. And she was then subsequently voted the Female Athlete of the Year. She went on to win 11 Grand Slam tournaments, and she was inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame and the International Women's Sports Hall of Fame. This is Babe Didrikson Zaharis, considered to be regarded as one of the greatest athletes of all time. She was also a multi-sport professional. She excelled in golf, basketball, baseball, and track and field. She won 2 gold medals in track and field in the 1932 Olympics, and then became a professional golfer, winning 10 LPGA tournament titles. This next series of slides talks about sports in the UP. This is the Ingot, a newspaper that was published in Hancock in the early 1900s. And beginning in 1905, they started discussing the girls began playing basketball. They were practicing diligently at the YMCA for 3 hours a week and showing great skill in the game. And then they go on to show the score of the game. This is the Ingot, November 1905. And again, they talk about the sports, talking about the success of the boys basketball team, the football team, but they also go on to state that it was the same with the girls team, which had won a majority of the games played. This is the ingot, December 1905, and again, they run the basketball score. This was only at halftime. After having secured a lead of 6 points, they went on to defeat by a score, or got defeated by a score of 11-8. This is an interesting one, I thought, February 1906, because this is when girls started playing hockey. They talk about that two high school teams of girls were practicing and beginning to organize to play hockey. And they went to talk to the coach, Cause, who put on a serene countenance and winked with the other eye and looked wise. One of the young boys managed to find a knothole and avows that the girls never touched the puck once. But at any rate, the teams were organized and the girls were going forward, and they were doing it for fun, and from reports received from unwilling sources, they were getting it. They went on to do a little parody of Shakespeare, Rink and Puck, talking about girls and hockey, and I thought it was a little tongue-in-cheek, poking a little bit of fun at the girls, but I thought it was done in a very good humored fashion. And the last two lines, Rink says to Puck, "Indeed, it is a strange disposed time, but women construe things after their fashion, clean from the purpose of the things themselves. And are you then hurt much?" Puck, "No, that's just the point. They did not touch me once. So long." I just thought that was a little bit of a amusement there. So these are some of the pictures of the teams that have played hockey throughout the decades. This is probably around, I would imagine, 1906. Please notice that the girls have skirts on. This may account for the reason why they had a hard time hitting the puck. Can you imagine trying to skate and play hockey in skirts? This is the 1926 Osceola women's team. Notice, though, that they're wearing much more appropriate garb. They have knickers on, as well as jackets, making it probably a lot easier to play hockey. This is the 1977-78 house team, much more professional-looking gear and uniforms. In the 1960s, this is the Dollar Bay team. They don't have an exact date on this team. 1996-97 K-Wings, very professional looking uniforms with good gear. This is the Tamarack and Yellow Jacket Girls Hockey Club. Again, lots of smiling faces. 2001-2002 Calumet women's team, very professional looking. We're going to talk now about the UP Sports Hall of Fame. There are a total of 49 women now in the UP, inducted in the UP Sports Hall of Fame, 24 for basketball, 10 in golf, 3 in track, and so on. It is not uncommon for a number of the women that are in the UP Sports Hall of Fame, though, to be accomplished in more than one sport, and we'll show examples of this. This is Nicole Emblad. She was a basketball star at St. Ignace High School, voted UP All-Class. She went on to be Associated Press Class C Player of the Year, the best of the best, selected in the Detroit News, and a Dream Team, Detroit Free Press Dream Team member. This is Sarah Boyer Road. She's the pride of Rapid River. She was outstanding in several sports, but best known for her prowess on the basketball court. She earned 12 high school letters, including 4 in basketball, 4 in track, and 4 in volleyball. She was the first UP student athlete to win tomorrow's winner award for the Michigan Sports Hall of Fame. So she's not only in the UP Sports Hall of Fame, but she's also mentioned or has been named to the Michigan Sports Hall of Fame. First one from the UP. So she was also voted Class D state player. She also held the 300 hurdles record and was a winner for the 5 UP hurdle titles in track. She went on to with a successful basketball career at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, and is a basketball coach at the Notre Dame Academy in Green Bay. These are the 2 inductees for this year. This is Kangas Brody. She was a 3-sport champion in Lawrence High School, winning the Upper Peninsula League Golf League Association. She went on to play golf at Michigan State and was captain for 2 years. She was named to the All Big Ten team in 1996. And then she went on to play in the LPGA, posting 4 LPGA victories on tour. Since 2005, though, she's been giving golf lessons and owns a retail golf operation at Warwick Hills. I believe that's downstate, somewhere around Bloomfield Hills. I have played Warwick. It's a really beautiful course. She won 25 high school golf events and was second in one other. She's also a 3-time All-State selection, All-UP basketball, and also played volleyball. Julie held wonders from Iron Mountain, was also a 3-sport athlete, 3-time basketball MVP, played basketball and softball for 4 years and volleyball for 3 years. She went on to play basketball for 2 years at Lake Michigan College and is in the school's Hall of Fame, scoring over 1,100 points during her career. Then transferred to Northern Michigan and set a single season record of 715 points, scoring 1,200 points. Was named to GLIAC Player of the Year and Kodak All-American in 1993. The headline, the banquet to induct these two was supposed to be on 3/20/20, but you can see that this was right at the time of the closure of all groups for the COVID crisis. So hopefully they'll have their moment in the sun. Now, we can't leave without talking about the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. If you remember a league of their own, we did have 3 women from the Upper Peninsula that played for the Grand Rapids Chicks. This is Ruby Sermon. Her maiden name was Stojkovic. She is from Negaunee. She batted right-handed, but threw right-handed, but was an ambidextrous batter and unfortunately passed away in 2008. This is Karen Kunkel, maiden name Violetta. She also was from Negaunee. She batted and threw right-handed, and she passed away recently in 2017. And then this is Rosemary Stevenson, nicknamed Stevie. She was from Stalwart, Michigan. She threw right-handed but batted left-handed, which is most unusual. She recently also passed away in 2017. I thought this was interesting because I had played softball for a couple of years with my mom on the same team. And my mom was a natural lefty, but she threw right-handed but batted left-handed as well. So I thought that was kind of interesting. That might have had to do with her training in Catholic schools because they forced left-handed handers to right-handed. So that's probably why she was able to throw right-handed. And this is Rosemary's baseball picture. The girls in the American Baseball League had baseball cards just like the men did. So I don't know if those are collectibles now. I've never seen them. As you might know from the movie, this league was started during World War II because the men were off fighting overseas. The CEO of Clark Candy Bar started the All-Americans Women's Professional Baseball League. They recruited women from all over the country and Canada. Now, we can't leave the UP and women's athletics without giving a nod to the Keweenaw Roller Girls, very active roller derby club in the Houghton, Michigan area. They play at the D. They had a recent article published in the Mining Gazette on their schedule, and also a recent blurb in the Keweenaw Report. This is the picture of this year's team. They have a Facebook page as well, so if you're interested, you should go check it out. And then one last thing to share. This is a story called Unbreakable. This is the woman who defied the Nazis in the world's most dangerous horse race. This is a story of the intrepid Czech countess who took on the Nazi SS in the most arduous steeplechase race in Europe. There's a book on it, an article, and a podcast that's available. So that concludes my presentation. I would like to give a special thanks to John Hausler for his archival research on the ingot articles and his contribution with the UP Sports Hall of Fame. John had sent me over 30 pictures of articles throughout the early 1900s from the ingot. So you can see that they were very dedicated to reporting on women's sports. Also, a special thanks to Faith Morrison for moderating this and for the information that she provided on the Czech Countess, and also her additional information on the UP Sports Hall of Fame, as well as the baseball players for the Women's Professional Baseball League, and for her technical provision as well. And special thanks to Elise Nelson and the Carnegie Museum for hosting this event.